I want to state something clearly at the start, because I think clarity is more respectful than softening. Belief in God is a mistake, not a moral failing, not evidence of low intelligence, not a character flaw, a mistake, a systematic error in reasoning that the human brain makes when evaluating a specific kind of question under specific conditions. Everyone makes mistakes. I make mistakes. You make mistakes. The human brain is extraordinarily good at many things: pattern recognition, social reasoning, causal inference, but it is also prone to specific, predictable errors, cognitive biases, systematic failures of reasoning that occur even in intelligent, careful, well-intentioned people. And the belief in God is one of those errors. I am not saying this to be provocative. I am saying it because I think it is true, and I think the evidence supports it, and I want to show you that evidence. 6 systematic errors. 6 places where the brain's reasoning machinery produces the wrong output when applied to the God question. 6 biases that, together, explain why billions of people believe something that is not true. Let me be clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying believers are stupid. Intelligence is not the issue. Smart people believe in God. Very smart people. People far smarter than me in many domains. I'm not saying believers are lying. The belief is sincere. It feels true from the inside. The phenomenology of religious experience is real. People genuinely feel the presence of God, genuinely believe they have been answered in prayer, genuinely experience their faith as contact with something real. What I am saying is that the feeling of truth is not reliable evidence of truth. The brain produces feelings of certainty about things that are false all the time. Optical illusions feel true. False memories feel true. Confabulations feel true. The subjective certainty of a belief is not correlated with the belief's accuracy. And when you examine the cognitive processes that produce belief in God, what you find is not evidence-based reasoning. What you find is systematic errors in reasoning, errors that are well documented in cognitive science, errors that apply to everyone, including me, in different contexts. Belief in God is what happens when those errors are applied to the biggest question there is. Let me show you the errors. The first error is confirmation bias, the tendency to remember evidence that supports your belief and forget evidence that contradicts it. The second error is apophenia, seeing patterns in randomness, the brain's pattern detection machinery misfiring on noise. The third error is the gambler's fallacy applied to prayer, treating divine responses as if it follows the statistics of a fair process. The fourth error is survivorship bias, hearing only from the people whose prayers were answered, not from the vastly larger number whose prayers were not. The fifth error is cultural anchoring, believing what you were taught as a child and calling it truth rather than recognizing it as cultural transmission. The sixth error is the Dunning-Kruger effect on cosmic questions, being confident about things you cannot possibly know, with confidence inversely proportional to actual knowledge. 6 errors, all well documented in cognitive science, all operating in the God belief. Let's examine them. Here's an experiment you can do yourself. Ask a religious person to tell you about times their prayers were answered. Most will have multiple stories, specific instances where they prayed for something and it happened. A sick relative who recovered, a job they needed and got, a problem that resolved just when they needed it, too. These stories feel like evidence. They feel like demonstrations that prayer works, that God responds, that the belief is justified. Now, ask the same person, how many times have you prayed for something that didn't happen? Most people cannot answer this question accurately. They don't remember. The unanswered prayers fade. The prayers that worked are encoded strongly in memory. The ones that didn't are forgotten. This is confirmation bias, the tendency to selectively remember evidence that confirms your existing belief and forget or discount evidence that contradicts it. It is not conscious, it is not dishonest, it is how memory works under the influence of belief. Confirming evidence gets rehearsed, retold, integrated into your narrative. Disconfirming evidence gets categorized as not relevant, or I must not have prayed right, or God said no for a reason, and then it fades. The result, your memory contains a biased sample of your prayer experiences. The sample is biased toward prayers that worked. And when you reflect on your experience, you consult your memory. Your memory says, prayers work. Therefore, God exists. But your memory is lying to you, not maliciously, systematically, because confirmation bias has distorted the encoding process. Here's a more general version of the same problem. Every religion claims to have evidence. Christians point to answered prayers, personal experiences of God, the historicity of Jesus, the transformation of lives. Muslims point to the Quran's literary perfection, scientific miracles in the text, the rapid spread of Islam. Hindus point to ancient wisdom, mystical experiences, the continuity of tradition. All of them feel their belief is supported by evidence. All of them experience their faith as reasonable, justified, grounded in reality, but they can't all be right. Christianity and Islam make contradictory claims about Jesus. Hinduism and Islam make contradictory claims about God's nature. At most, one of them is true. Probably none of them is true. So, why does each feel supported by evidence? Confirmation bias. Each tradition selectively encodes evidence that supports its claims and discards evidence that contradicts it. The Christian remembers the prayers that worked and forgets the ones that didn't. The Muslim reads the Quran looking for scientific miracles and finds them because the text is vague enough to be retrofitted to almost any discovery. The Hindu experiences mystical states and attributes them to Hindu deities because that is the interpretive framework available. The evidence each tradition points to is real. The experiences are real, but the interpretation is biased by confirmation bias. The brain is pattern, matching experiences to pre-existing rather than evaluating beliefs based on unbiased evidence. Confirmation bias is not unique to religion. Scientists experience it. I experience it. Everyone experiences it. It is a fundamental feature of how belief shapes perception and memory. But religion is uniquely vulnerable to it because religious claims are difficult to test and easy to retrofit. A prayer worked or it didn't work, yet, or God said no. The claim can be adjusted to fit any outcome. The flexibility makes confirmation bias extraordinarily powerful. The belief in God feels supported by evidence because confirmation bias ensures that the evidence you remember is the evidence that supports the belief. That is not how truth works. That is how cognitive bias works. Now, let me tell you about a feature of the brain that is usually adaptive, but occasionally produces completely false beliefs. The human brain is pattern detection machinery. This is one of its core functions, detecting patterns in sensory input, in sequences of events, in the behavior of other people. Pattern detection is how we learn, how we predict, how we survive. But here's the thing about pattern detection machinery. It detects patterns even when there are none. Apophenia is the technical term, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in random or meaningless data. You see a face in the clouds, there is no face. It is random condensation, but your visual system detects a pattern that matches face, and reports it to consciousness as a face. You flip a coin 10 times, it comes up heads 6 times. You think, this coin is biased toward heads. But 6 heads out of 10 is well within the range of what random chance produces. The pattern you detected is noise. You hear a song on the radio just as you're thinking about someone. You think that's a sign, they're thinking about me. But thousands of songs play on the radio every day. The probability that one of them coincides with a thought about a person is high. The coincidence is not a pattern. It is statistics. The brain is built to detect patterns, and in a noisy environment, which the real world is, it will detect patterns that are not there. False positives. The cost of a false positive, thinking there's a pattern when there isn't, is usually low. The cost of a false negative, missing a real pattern, can be high. So, the system is biased toward detecting patterns, even when the evidence is weak. Now apply this to religion. A person prays for rain, it rains the next day, pattern detected, prayer rain. Divine intervention. But what is the actual pattern? In a given week, the probability of rain is, say, 30%. The probability that rain occurs within 24 hours of a prayer for rain is also 30%. The prayer did not cause the rain. The rain was going to happen anyway, but the brain detects the temporal proximity and interprets it as causation. A person prays for a job, they get the job, pattern detected, prayer for a job, divine intervention. But they also submitted a resume, went to an interview, demonstrated their skills. The job was the result of those actions. The prayer was temporally proximate, but causally irrelevant. The brain detects the pattern and attributes causation incorrectly. A person thinks of a deceased relative and sees a butterfly. They interpret this as a sign, the relative's spirit visiting them. But butterflies are common. The probability of seeing one while thinking about someone is not low. The pattern is coincidence, not communication. Apophenia is why people see Jesus in toast, why they hear messages in random noise, why they find meaning in numerical coincidences. The brain is doing what it is built to do, detecting patterns. But it is detecting patterns in randomness, and religion is full of apophenia miracles, signs, answered prayers, meaningful coincidences. Almost all of them are random events that brains have pattern matched into divine intervention. The statistical test is simple. If prayers worked, you would see a correlation between praying and outcome that exceeds chance. You don't. Studies of intercessory prayer show no effect beyond placebo. The answered prayers that people report are statistically indistinguishable from coincidence. But the brain doesn't run statistical tests. The brain detects patterns, and when a prayer is followed by a desired outcome, the brain reports, pattern detected, God answered. That is not evidence of God. That is evidence of apophony. This error is subtle, but I think it is extraordinarily common among believers. The gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that if a random event has not occurred for a while, it is due to occur soon. You flip a fair coin, it comes up heads 5 times in a row. You think the next flip is more likely to be tails because heads has come up so many times. Tails is due, but the coin has no memory. The probability of the next flip being tails is 50%, just like it was for the previous flips. The past outcomes do not affect the future probability. Each flip is independent. The gambler's fallacy is treating independent events as if they are linked, as if the universe keeps track and balances things out. Now, watch what happens when people apply this reasoning to prayer. A person prays for something repeatedly, they don't get it, they pray again, they don't get it. They pray 10 times, 20 times, 100 times. No response, and then they think, I've prayed so many times. God must be about to answer. The answer is coming soon. I just need to keep praying. This is the gambler's fallacy, treating divine response as if it has the statistics of a fair random process. As if God is flipping a coin, and the coin is due to come up in your favor because it has come up against you so many times. But if God is responding to prayer, the response is not a random process. It is a decision made by an agent. Agents don't follow the statistics of coin flips. If God has not answered your prayer after 100 requests, that is not evidence that the answer is coming soon. That is evidence that God is not answering. Unless, of course, you believe God responds randomly, in which case prayer is pointless. You're just hoping to get lucky. The gambler's fallacy also works in reverse. People who have experienced what they interpret as answered prayers believe they are blessed or favored, and that future prayers are more likely to be answered. This is the hot hand fallacy, the belief that success breeds success, that you're on a streak. But if divine response is not random, there is no such thing as a hot hand with prayer. If God answers prayers based on reasons, those reasons don't change because you got lucky once. The entire framing of prayer is something that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't is incoherent, unless you believe divine response is random. If it's not random, the pattern of answered and unanswered prayers should tell you something about what God wants. If it is random, prayer is superstition. Either way, the gambler's fallacy is not valid reasoning, but people use it constantly. They keep praying because they think the answer is due. They stop praying because they think they've used up their luck. They treat divine response as if it follows statistical patterns of randomness. It is a reasoning error. And it keeps people praying long after the evidence has made clear that prayer does not work. Confirmation bias makes you remember only the prayers that worked. Epiphania makes you see divine patterns in random coincidences. And the gambler's fallacy keeps you praying because you think the answer is due. The next 3 errors are even more devastating. One is about where you were born, and one is about how much you actually know. Subscribe, back in 30 seconds. This error is responsible for some of the most persistent and most damaging false beliefs about prayer. Survivorship bias is the logical error of concentrating on the entities that survived a selection process while overlooking those that did not. The classic example: during World War II, the military studied planes returning from missions to see where they had been hit by gunfire. They wanted to add armor to those locations, but a statistician named Abraham Wald pointed out the error. The planes you're looking at survived. The places they were hit are the places where you can take damage and still make it back. The places you should armor are the places where the surviving planes are not damaged because the planes that got hit there didn't survive to be examined. The visible sample, the planes that returned, is biased. You are not seeing the planes that were shot down. Now, apply this to prayer and miracles. You hear about the cancer patient who prayed and went into remission. You hear about the child who was in a car accident and survived after the whole church prayed. You hear about the person who prayed for a job and got one. These stories circulate. They get told in churches. They get shared on social media. They feel like evidence that prayer works. But you do not hear about the cancer patients who prayed and died. You do not hear about the children who were in car accidents and didn't survive despite prayer. You do not hear about the thousands of people who prayed for jobs and remain unemployed. Why? Because the dead don't give testimonies. The people whose prayers were not answered don't go to church and share their stories of failure. The sample you hear from is biased towards success. This makes prayer look far more effective than it is. If prayer worked at the rate the testimony suggests, every church would be full of people reporting miraculous healings. But the base rate of spontaneous remission in cancer is approximately 1 in 100, 0, 0. When you have 1,000,000 people praying for healing, 10 of them will experience spontaneous remission. Those 10 will attribute it to prayer. The 990 who died will not be heard from. The visible sample makes prayer look effective. The actual statistics show it is indistinguishable from chance. Here is a way to test for survivorship bias. Ask, if prayer didn't work at all, what would the world look like? It would look like this. Some people would pray and get what they prayed for by coincidence. Those people would tell stories about answered prayers. Most people would pray and not get what they prayed for. Those people would either lose faith or rationalize the failure. God said no, it wasn't the right time, I need to pray harder. The ones who keep faith would be the ones who happened to get lucky or who are good at rationalization. That is exactly what we see. Survivorship bias makes the success rate of prayer look much higher than it is because you only hear from the successes. The failures are invisible, and this is not just about prayer, it's about all miracle claims. You hear about the person who survived a plane crash and thank God for the miracle. You don't hear from the 200 people who didn't survive. The survivor is visible, the dead are not. The sample is biased. And biased samples produce false beliefs. This is the error that I find most statistically devastating. Here is a fact about religious belief that should trouble anyone who thinks belief is about truth rather than cultural transmission. Approximately 96% of people believe the same religion as their parents. Let me say that again. If you are Christian, there is a 96% chance you were raised Christian. If you are Muslim, there is a 96% chance you were raised Muslim. If you are Hindu, there is a 96% chance you were raised Hindu. The correlation between your religion and your parents' religion is stronger than almost any correlation in social science. Now ask yourself, if religious belief were about truth, if people were evaluating evidence and coming to conclusions about which religion is correct, why would there be a 96% correlation with parental belief? The answer is obvious. Religious belief is not about evidence. It is about cultural transmission. You believe what you were taught as a child. You believe what your community believes. The evidence you cite is post hoc rationalization of a belief you already hold for cultural reasons. Here's the test. If you were born in Saudi Arabia to Muslim parents, would you be Christian? Almost certainly not. If you were born in India to Hindu parents, would you be Muslim? Almost certainly not. Your belief is overwhelmingly predicted by the accident of where and when and to whom you were born. That is not how truth works. Truth is independent of geography. The speed of light is the same in Saudi Arabia and India and America. The laws of thermodynamics don't change based on your parents' religion, but belief in God does. The specific God you believe in, the specific doctrines, the specific holy books, the specific rituals. All of these are predicted by cultural accident, not by evidence. If Christianity were true, you would expect conversions to be based on evidence evaluation. You would expect people in all cultures to independently discover Christian truths through reason and investigation. That is not what happens. Christianity spreads through missionary work, through cultural dominance, through parents teaching children. The same is true for Islam, Hinduism, and every other religion. The 96% correlation is not evidence that your religion is true. It is evidence that your religion is a product of cultural anchoring, the cognitive bias of accepting as true whatever you were taught early in life, before you had the critical thinking skills to evaluate it. Children believe what adults tell them. This is adaptive. Children need to learn from their elders, but it means that false beliefs, if transmitted culturally, will persist across generations regardless of their truth value. And that is exactly what we see with religion. False beliefs, contradictory claims about God's nature, incompatible cosmologies, mutually exclusive salvation doctrines, all persisting because they were transmitted culturally, not because they were discovered to be true. The accident of birth is not evidence, it is noise, and the 96% correlation shows that religious belief is overwhelmingly determined by noise, not signal. And now the final error, the one that I find most personally interesting because it applies to almost everyone. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the cognitive bias where people with low competence in a domain overestimate their competence. People who know very little about a subject are often extremely confident in their opinions about it. As competence increases, confidence initially decreases. You learn enough to realize how much you don't know. This applies with extraordinary force to cosmic questions. Ask a person with no training in cosmology, "Why does the universe exist?" They will give you an answer, often a confident answer. God created it, or it's always existed, or it came from nothing. They will state this as if it is obvious. Ask a cosmologist the same question. They will give you a careful, hedged response. We have models that suggest we don't know yet. The person with no expertise is confident. The person with expertise is uncertain. This is Dunning-Kruger. Now apply this to God. People are confident about what God wants, what God thinks, what happens after death, the purpose of the universe, the meaning of suffering. These are questions that, if they have answers at all, are among the most difficult questions imaginable. But people with no training in theology, no background in philosophy, no understanding of the physics of the cosmos, these people will tell you with complete confidence that they know the answers. Because God told them, because it says so in their holy book, because their priest said so. The confidence is inversely proportional to knowledge. The less you know about cosmology, the more certain you are about why the universe exists. The less you know about neuroscience, the more certain you are about the soul. The less you know about physics, the more certain you are about miracles. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect in action, and it is endemic to religious belief. Actual experts, cosmologists, neuroscientists, physicists, are far less confident about cosmic questions. Not because they lack faith, because they understand the complexity. They know how much is unknown. They know that confident answers to cosmic questions are almost always wrong. But people without expertise don't know what they don't know. So they are confident, and the confidence feels like knowledge. It feels like certainty. It feels like truth. It is not truth. It is cognitive bias. The Dunning-Kruger effect explains why religious believers are often more confident in their cosmic claims than scientists are in their carefully evidenced theories. The scientists know how hard the questions are. The believers don't, and not knowing how hard the questions are makes you think the answers are easy. I want to sit with something for a moment. Every error I have described, confirmation bias, apophenia, a gambler's fallacy, survivorship bias, cultural anchoring, Dunning-Kruger, these are not unique to religion. They are not evidence that religious people are defective. These errors are human universals. Everyone makes them. I make them in contexts outside religion. You make them. The smartest people I know make them. The brain is not a truth detection device. It is a survival device. And these errors, these biases, are features, not bugs. They kept our ancestors alive. Confirmation bias makes you confident in your beliefs, which is useful for social cohesion. Apophenia detects real patterns most of the time. Cultural anchoring transmits useful knowledge across generations, but they are also errors. They produce false beliefs systematically, predictably, and when you apply them to the God question, to the biggest, most emotionally important question humans ask, they produce a false belief that feels absolutely true. That is what I find remarkable. The machinery works normally. The errors are operating as designed, and the output is a completely false belief in which billions of people have absolute confidence. The errors are universal, but they are also correctable. You can learn to detect confirmation bias in yourself. You can learn to distinguish patterns from noise. You can learn to avoid the gambler's fallacy. You can account for survivorship bias. You can recognize cultural anchoring. You can calibrate your confidence to your actual knowledge. These are skills, cognitive skills, and they can be learned. The belief in God is not inevitable. It is the default output of uncorrected cognitive biases. When you correct the biases, when you learn to reason carefully, evaluate evidence fairly, account for your blind spots, the belief dissolves. Not for everyone, but for enough people that it is clear the belief is a mistake that can be corrected. Let me say what the 6 errors add up to. Confirmation bias makes you remember evidence that supports belief and forget evidence that contradicts it. Apophenia makes you see divine patterns in random noise. The gambler's fallacy makes you keep praying because you think the answer is due. Survivorship bias means you only hear from the people whose prayers worked, not the vast majority whose prayers didn't. Cultural anchoring means you believe what you were taught as a child and call it truth. And Dunning-Kruger makes you confident about cosmic questions you cannot possibly answer. 6 errors, all well documented in cognitive science, all producing false beliefs in predictable ways, all operating when people form beliefs about God. The belief in God is not a moral failing. It is a cognitive one, a systematic error in how brains evaluate evidence, detect patterns, and assess probability. Everyone makes these errors. They are human, but being human doesn't make them right. It makes them understandable and correctable. You can learn to detect these errors in yourself. You can learn to compensate for them. You can learn to reason more carefully, evaluate evidence more fairly, calibrate confidence to knowledge more accurately. And when you do, when you apply the same standards of reasoning to religious claims that you apply to every other kind of claim, the belief in God does not survive. Not because you have become hostile to religion, because you have learned to detect and correct the errors that produce false beliefs. The brain makes mistakes. This is one of them, and the solution is not to defend the mistake. The solution is to correct it.